Good day, everyone, or I should say good evening. Welcome to this lecture on how to write a scope and delimitation or thesis and dissertations. By the way, I'm on official travel and I get bored in my hotel accommodation, so I have to record this short video lecture before I return to my desk next week. Um, As I mentioned in my other lectures, this is part of my class in the Graduate School of Eastern Visayas State University, specifically on Education 505 Methods of Research. And please take note that I implemented the blended learning modality in my class so that in addition to the face-to-face session every first and third Saturday or second and fourth Saturday, for our face-to-face sessions, I asked my students to perform tasks in Moodle as our learning management system. And so to make sure that all my students can catch up with my lessons in writing the thesis or dissertation proposals, I pre-record the lectures and make them available uh, through Moodle. Again, our learning management system at Eastern Visayas State University. So yeah, let me dive right into the discussion. Again, this is just a very short discussion on how to write the scope and delimitation. Just like in my other lectures, I start with the objectives, and there are three objectives in this lecture. The first one is to explain very briefly the meaning of the scope of the study. Second is to explain very briefly the meaning of the delimitation of the study. And then I will briefly distinguish delimitation from limitation later on in the following slides. And third objective is to provide an example of a scope and delimitation section of a thesis or dissertation. So I would just like to emphasize this one, just like in my other video lectures, I said I have the habit of including the what, the why, and the how in my lectures. So the main intention in this lecture is to provide you with an example, some guides and tips on writing the scope and delimitation, and provide you with a sample. So I focus more on the how, but my argument is we cannot fully make sense of the discussion if we if I don't include the what and the why. So I begin with what really is a scope and delimitation as part of our thesis or dissertation proposals, and then explain very briefly why do we need to do that? Why do we need to include this section in our proposal? Before I before I present to you the techniques or the steps in preparing the scope and delimitation and some sample of it. Okay. So very briefly on the scope of on the definition of the scope of this study. So what really is the scope of the study? The scope, as the term suggests, is what the study exactly includes. So to be specific, the scope of the study defines the boundaries, extents, and coverage of the study. And it is the scope of the study that sets the parameters within which the research is conducted, clarifying what the study includes and focuses on. So, obviously, we need to know the parameters, we need to know the scope, the boundaries, the extents, and the coverage of the study, in addition to the background of the study, the theoretical framework, the conceptual framework. We know exactly the direction of the study, and we know what not to include, what parameters to exclude, and things like that. So, with the scope of the study clearly defined in our study, then we don't get lost, or we can maintain, the consistency and of course, scientificity of this study. So that's exactly what we meant by the scope of the study, and the scope of the study normally includes the subject matter, that is what is being studied. For example, we say online learning or we say student motivation. It also includes population or sample. that is who or what is being studied. For example, we say grade 12 students in public schools. It also includes geographical coverage, or say locale of the study when we write um the methodology part of this of our proposal. And this so includes what is where the study is going to be conducted, the locale of the study. For example, let's say Eastern Visayas or the Philippines as a whole. Then we have the time frame. So we need to exactly know, the time frame. When shall the study start? When shall it ends? So that is, when is the study conducted? For example, we may say school year 2024, 2025. Okay. And then we have variables for quantitative research, or we have key concepts and factors for qualitative research. That is what specific aspects are being examined. For example, we may say teaching strategies, student engagement. So these are the important parameters, important factors that we need to include to articulate when writing the scope of the study. Okay, so let me proceed now to very briefly on the definition of the delimitation of the study. If the scope of the study is what we exactly include, the delimitation is what we exactly excludes in the study. And to be specific, the delimitation refers to the boundaries and choices that a researcher intentionally sets to narrow the focus of a study. So, contra limitation of the study, when it comes to the delimitation, we have as researchers full control on what to delimit. So this is within our control, unlike the limitation, which I will explain very briefly later on. Okay, so notes that the delimitation is within the control of the researcher, as I already mentioned, unlike the limitation of the study. Now, why the need to include the delimitation part of our proposal, of our thesis and dissertation proposals? This is very important because the delimitation helps define what the study will not cover, which populations, variables, or settings are excluded, why certain aspects are intentionally left out. Okay, so say for example, if you're doing a PhD thesis and we have the practice in the Philippines or in the graduate school of Eastern Visayas State University, that if it's going to be PhD study, the scope and the coverage should be province-wide already or region-wide. So our subjects, for example, our participants will be located all throughout the region, for example. And if if the locale, the scope is the region, there might the question, why not include the other regions, or why not include the entire Philippines, as the scope of the study? So that's where the idea of delimitation comes in. So you may say, for example, that it would have been better if the study includes other regions of the Philippines, but I focus only on region 8, given the time frame and resources. So time frame for PhD studies, or you normally have just 1 year or 2 semesters to complete the study, and that as a PhD students, normally you don't have a research grant for that purpose, so you don't have enough funds to conduct the study, so you delimit it. However, you argue that even if even if I focus only, I delimit my study on the, let's say, senior high school students in region 8. The argument is it can be replicated in other regions, or the results of the study might be true in other regions and things like that. So that is why the delimitation part. That is why we need to know what the study will not cover, the population, the variables, the settings, and aspects that we intentionally leave out. So that should be very clear from our reader or from from the panel of examiners, or if you're applying for a research grant, to the experts or the reviewers. We're going to, of course, examine your proposal. Okay, so that's how important the scope and delimitation is in our thesis and dissertations. Now, very briefly, let me, on a side note, explain the difference between the limitation of the study and the delimitation. A limitation of the study refers to the factors beyond the researcher's control that may affect the results or how the findings are interpreted. So these are limitations. Factors are necessary, may not be necessary in the study, but it will affect, of course, the results of the findings, the results of the study or how the findings are interpreted. And again, if we have full control, for example, in the delimitation part, if we have the full control in terms of limiting our scope, we just focus on region 8, for example, or we focus on a certain province or a certain locality that's within our control as researchers. But in the limitation parts, this is beyond our control. It's there, and it may affect, the results or the findings of the study. And that is why if a certain limitation arises in the conduct of the study, you should have some mechanisms in order to cushion its effects, or even leave out these limitations. Anyway, let me proceed. So, unlike the limitations, which are intentional boundaries set by the researcher, limitations are constraints or weaknesses that can influence the credibility, generalizability, or the applicability of the study. For example, I have research in Region 8 in Eastern Visayas. The title is the title of our research is Lived Experiences of the Math Teachers who teach math in the primary grades using the mother tongue. So teaching mathematics not in English but in the mother tongue, waray-waray. So if for example it's like 1 plus 1 or one chicken, 1 hen plus 1 hen equals 2 hens, and if you explain that using the mother tongue, it's a bit odd. Anyway, the point is, the limitation part in that research is, I am a Bisaya, I am a Buholano, but I'm residing in Tacloban in Leyte at the moment, and I have not yet mastered the Waray-Waray language. And so during the interview, my respondents, we are actually 7 in the research team, and I was the lead researcher. And then during the interview, of course, our participants are waray-waray teachers in the Department of Education, and of course we have to translate our our questions into waray-waray. And myself being a Bisaya, although I can understand some words or phrases in waray-waray language, but I have not mastered the language yet. And so that is why that is a limitation on my part, because my limited understanding or mastery on the waray-waray language may affect the results and findings of the study. So that's a concrete example of a limitation, and that's beyond my control. I cannot control that one. I don't need to spend 2 to 3 years mastering, studying the Waray language before I can, you know, um, I can proceed with the interview. So unlike the delimitation, wherein I have the full control in terms of setting the boundaries of my study, in the case of the limitation, there are factors like language barrier again, as a weakness, as a constraint that may affect the credibility, generalizability, or applicability of the study. So to cushion or to address that limitation, I make sure that in the interview I have with me a researcher from Leyte who is an expert in the Waray language. Okay, so that's a concrete example of a limitation of the study. And then there are common types of limitations. We have limitation in terms of sample size. For example, a small sample may limit the generalizability of findings. Now, let's say you're studying, for example, the lived experiences. Let me use the word the case of a lived experiences. The lived experiences of prisoners who are suffering from let's say depression. So um you're studying, for example, a prison cell in Tacloban City, and then we narrow down our subject prisoners or inmates who have who are experiencing depression at the moment. So even if we say we have 500 inmates in that cell, we narrow them down into, let's say there are just only 10 or let's say 20, inmates who are experiencing depression at the moment. So that sample size, you don't have control over that limitation. And so that small sample size may limits, the generalizability of the findings. But since your study is all about the lived experiences of the uh, inmates in the prison cell in Tacloban City who are experiencing depression, you have no control over it. Okay, so um, yeah, that's why it's a limitation on the parts of the study. And then another type of limitation is time constraints. You only have one semester or two semesters to complete the study and things like that. Okay. Anyway, so limited time may affect the depth of the data collection or analysis. So sometimes you have to, because we only have more semester to go, or the grant is ending in the next 2 months, so we rush things up, and then that's beyond our control now. It's a limitation in itself, and again, it will affect, the credibility, the generalizability, and the overall applicability and quality of the research. So we have to find ways on how to address these limitations. Like if it's going to be time constrained, so you have to really plan. That is why you have the time management or plan time management. So we have the project management system, in place when you're doing, let's say, especially if it's a huge project. So we have to be very um, um, particular about meeting deadlines, beating a milestone so that we won't be affected by, the study will not be affected by time constraints. And then participant honesty or bias. For example, respondents may provide inaccurate or socially desirable answers. So this is beyond our control. We cannot force our participants to be truthful all the time. Sometimes if they are not comfortable, if they are uncomfortable with the questions, let's say you're interviewing a group of inmates in Tacloban Correctional System or institution, and then they are not comfortable with the question, they may not tell you the truth. And there's no way for us to force them to tell the truth, to be honest at all times. Okay, so there's a limitation again. So in order to address that limitation, one of the best ways to address this limitation is to, before conducting interview with them or survey, we need to establish rapport with them. So you have to spend time with them, talking and having snacks with them or drinking some tea and coffee and things like that, just to set the mood for the interview or just to establish rapport between you and your participants. And then once you're able to, let's say, establish that rapport, you can feel that the participants already, open for the interview, that they are now ready to, give information in a voluntary, um, free manner. And so, in that way, we might be able to, minimize bias, or let's say aim for an honest answers from our participants. But as a whole, that is a limitation in our research. And then another type of limitation is the scope of generalization. For example, results may apply only to a specific group, location, or context. So we cannot replicate the study in other, regions, for example, because of issues about generalizability. Okay, so these are just samples of the limitations of the study. But again, in our proposals, in our thesis or dissertation proposals or thesis and dissertations as a whole, we don't normally include the limitation of the study there. We just have the scope and the delimitation. And then it's already understandable. The limitations will arise in the methodology part in the actual gathering of the studies. We just address them when we're gathering the data and processing them. Okay, so at this point, let me proceed to an example of a scope of delimitation of the study. This is the main intention of this lecture, to give you an example of how the scope how the scope and delimitation of the study is framed, is written. So let me give this an example. The title is digital literacy competences of senior high school students in selected public schools in Tacloban City. So if that's our research, if this is our working title, this could be our scope and delimitation. And as you can see, there are just two paragraphs in the scope and delimitation because you don't have to have a quite long scope and delimitation. But as you notice, if we read the first paragraph, the first paragraph is normally the scope. It reads, this study investigates the digital literacy skills of senior high school students in public schools in Tacloban City during the academic year 2024-2025. It focuses on assessing students' competencies in information retrieval, digital communication, and online safety. The participants include grade 12 students from three selected public high schools. Before I proceed to the next paragraph, notice, for example, this one, the subject matter is there, the population or sample is there, the geographical coverage is there, the time frame is there, and the variable is there as well. Okay, so that's how we simply but elegantly frame or writes the scope of the study. Now, the second paragraph is our delimitation. So, and it reads, the study is delimited to public schools. So we exclude private schools in this case. So you see, the study is delimited to public schools only, excluding private institutions due to time and access constraints. So as a researcher, you do not just say, I don't include private schools and that's it. You need to explain why you're excluding private schools in this case. Okay, so that is, I will say, excluding private institutions because of time and access constraints. So maybe you're doing a master's thesis and you only have one semester to gather the data and process it and write the manuscript or the results of the study. So a semester is not enough. Or maybe it's enough, but um, we cannot, deliver a reliable or a comprehensive data within a semester. So that is why you delimit um your study to public schools only, you know, um, in Tacloban City. Now, in terms of access as well. So when we ask permission from the principals or the district superintendent in the Department of Education, it takes time. So we have to, especially if you include the private schools in this case, you have to go to the schools and ask permission from the principal or the higher ups. And then once you have the approval from the principal, you have to ask permission from from the college or the department head. And once you have the permission from the heads of the departments or the college, then you have to write to your participants, and then secure their consent, informed consent and things like that. So in terms of access, a semester is enough for that purpose. That is why you need to delimit your study, but without, of course, sacrificing the quality of the results of the study. Let me proceed. It also limits its analysis to students' self-reported data rather than performance-based assessment. So it's just very clear that you focus only on self-reported data. And then the performance-based assessments, we will exclude that one because, again, because of time and access constraint. And then lastly, these choices were made to ensure manageability and consistency of data collection across all respondents. So as you can see, even if we delimit our study to public schools only, in fact, just three public schools in Tacloban City, but they are equally represented. based on our inclusion and exclusion criteria, we can guarantee that even if I focus only on these three schools, public schools, excluding private schools, the researcher can still provide a reliable, credible data and findings and results as a whole of the study. Okay. So as you can see in the delimitation part, it includes what the study will not cover, and we explain it why we will not cover it. And then it also includes which populations, variables, or settings are excluded. So that's how we write the scope and delimitation of the study, which is the last section of our the first chapter of our thesis or dissertation proposal before we proceed to the methodology. So in my next lectures, I will now be talking about the methodology part of thesis and dissertation, and I will write a specific methodology for a case study, in a qualitative research design, one lecture on the methodology, on how to write the methodology part of a phenomenological research design, another methodology part of grounded theory, another methodology part of ethnography, and then correlational research and the quantitative study, and so on and so forth. But for now, this is um, how we write why we write the scope and delimitation of our thesis and dissertations. So thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all the best in your thesis and dissertation writing. God bless everyone.